Welcome back, everyone, to another reaction video. Well, many of you may be aware that in just 1 week from today, my daughter Rachel and I are headed to France with a little stopover in London for a few hours before we take the train. I will be doing another video about the upcoming trip, and you can expect to see a lot of shorts, a lot of long-form content, probably a lot of collaboration videos coming up as I'm going to be there with a number of my YouTuber friends, including a few I haven't met yet. So I'm excited about all of that. But the highlight, obviously, of the trip is my very first time visiting Normandy. Pretty excited about that. Going to be there with a bunch of familiar faces. And like I said, you'll see more about that as we go. So I've been diving into research for some of the videos I'm going to be doing from Normandy. And with that in mind, I thought we would revisit our friend Griffin, the Armchair Historian, and take a look at his video, D-Day, from the German perspective. Now, I'll admit up front that compared to my knowledge of things like the American Civil War, U.S. presidents, or even World War I, World War II is not an area that I would consider myself any kind of an expert in. So I'm excited to learn a lot. I'm especially excited I'm going to get to spend some time on this tour with Paul Woodage as our tour guide, who is probably one of the most knowledgeable people on the planet when it comes to D-Day in Normandy. So I can't wait to learn from him, and I know that I'm going to come back in a few weeks with a lot more knowledge than I have now. But in the meantime, I'll put the link in the description to the original content. Please support Griffin. He does a fantastic job with his channel. Let's go ahead and check this one out.
Limited edition posters are up over at store.armchairhistory.tv and will be gone in just 2 weeks. Consider also picking up a new matte black mug, t-shirt, or one of the few remaining tank pins.
Those are nice.
All of your support helps the channel. A trio of German officers stand on the parapet of the Atlantic Wall. At their head is Erwin Rommel.
Zweifelt keinen Moment daran, dass die Amerikaner und Engländer landen werden. Aus ihren Schiffen wird sich eine Welle von Männern und Stahl auf unsere Strände ergießen und wir müssen darauf vorbereitet sein. Wir haben Minen, wir haben Panzersperren, wir haben den gesamten Strand aufgeklärt. Wenn wir doch nur die Panzerreserven hätten. Ob in Calais oder hier in der Normandie, es steht dasselbe auf dem Spiel. Das Schicksal Deutschlands hängt vom Ausgang der ersten 24 Stunden der Landung ab.
So there was a real debate amongst the German high command about the best strategy for dealing with the Allies when they invaded, because everybody knew it was going to happen. The only question was when and where. And it seemed obvious to pretty much everybody it was either going to be Calais or Normandy. If you're familiar at all, you know that the Allies spent a great deal of time and effort convincing the Germans it was going to be Calais, and then landed at Normandy. Rommel, who had been placed in charge over the last year or two of building the Atlantic Wall and preparing the defenses, he was not the overall commander in Normandy or in the West, but he was in charge of preparing the defenses, and he did the best he could with what he had. He flooded fields inland to prevent paratroopers. They put all these poles up to deal with gliders when they came in. They put stuff on the beaches to deal with landing craft as they came in. But Rommel's belief was you had to defeat the enemy at the beach. That if the Allies were able to get a foothold, the war was done. That there was nothing the Germans were going to be able to do. And so he wanted to keep the Panzer reserves closer so that when you knew where the beach landings happened, you could immediately counterattack and drive them off before they could get a foothold. But other commanders who overruled him believed that you let the Allies land. Well, you don't let them, but your way of defeating them is to let them get a little bit inland, and then you cut them off, destroy them, push them back, whatever. Rommel was probably right.
Für die Alliierten als auch für Deutschland wird es der längste Tag werden.
Thus the name of the movie.
Hi, I'm Griffin Johnson, the Armchair Historian. The story of D-Day and its accompanying airborne and partisan operations is well known from the Allied perspective, but seldom is this critical juncture of the Second World War looked at through the eyes of those defending the Atlantic Wall. Seldom are the stories of individual German soldiers studied. In today's episode, we will revisit our most popular video, D-Day from the German perspective, and bring you recollections from the men who saw the French sky darken with paratroopers and the English Channel teem with battleships, and knew that the end of the Reich was at hand. Here's a quick question for you. What did George Patton, Albert Kesselring, and Bernard Montgomery all have in common? Well, aside from being officers in the Second World War, they all suffered from unfortunate cases of male pattern baldness. And as we all know, those who fail to learn from history are doomed to repeat it.
Not only that, but Patton also suffered from dyslexia. And that led to the belief as a kid growing up in the late 1800s that he was stupid, or that he, in some way lacked intelligence because he struggled in school. But it had nothing to do with his intelligence. It had everything to do with a learning disability that he couldn't control.
Which is why today's video is sponsored by Keeps, a subscription service focused on making it easy for men seeking treatment for baldness. Featuring 24/7 access to a licensed doctor with personalized treatment plans, affordable versions of FDA-approved medication, and more 5-star reviews than any competitor, Keeps is the obvious choice for any man interested in keeping his hairline intact during even the longest and most stressful campaign.
What a way to work that in. That was good. I like that. So I'm very lucky. I'm going to be 46 this year, and I still have most of my hair, though it's getting a little grayer all the time, in some places even white. But yeah, my hairline's gone back some from where it used to be. But in my family, male pattern baldness runs in the family pretty deeply, so I'm very lucky to still have my hair.
If you're ready to take action and prevent hair loss, go to keeps.com/armchairhistorian or click the link in the description below to receive 50% off of your first order. That's keeps.com/armchairhistorian. The D-Day landings did not take the Germans completely by surprise. On the contrary, the highest echelons of German command were well aware that an invasion was imminent and of the least possible threat. The Führer was confident that the Atlantic Wall, stretching from the border of Spain to Norway, would not only repulse any Allied landing, but cause so many Commonwealth and American casualties that the Western Allies would lose their capacity to continue the war. Fritz Bayerlein, a senior aide to Erwin Rommel in Africa and later commander of the Panzer-Lehr Division at Normandy, held the debacle at Dieppe up as incontrovertible proof the Allies could not manage an amphibious assault.
Yeah, but here's the thing about Dieppe. Yes, it went horribly wrong, but the Allies learned a lot about what not to do because of that raid at Dieppe. They understood from Dieppe that there were certain things that when the big landings came weren't going to be able to happen. So though Dieppe was a failure and it was viewed by everyone as such, sometimes we have to learn the important lessons through failure. And had they tried what they tried at Dieppe on a larger scale at Normandy, it might have failed had they not learned those lessons.
The series of successful Allied amphibious landings in Italy gave even Hitler pause, however, and he placed Rommel in charge of shoring up the defenses along the English Channel. Rommel's task was an enviable one. Concrete was at a premium, with the lion's share of Germany's supply going to the construction of hardened U-boat shelters per Hitler's direct orders.
And it's an interesting thing because when you hear the descriptions of the concrete that was used on the Atlantic Wall, that it was a poor quality, but it held up really well. When you look at the absolute pounding that the Allies gave the Atlantic Wall in the Normandy region before they landed, the hundreds and hundreds of warships, the thousands of bombers, even on the morning of D-Day, that dropped bombs. Now, granted, they didn't all hit their targets, but the concrete held up pretty well for not being the best quality.
French laborers and Italian POWs were conscripted to improve the defenses. Turrets from captured French tanks were made into makeshift emplacements named Tobruk's after a jury-rigged reinforced firing pit Italian soldiers had built with buried cement pipes in North Africa. And
a similar thing happened, not with the concrete with the turret on top, but the Soviets did a similar thing on the Eastern Front. where they would bury their tanks to where only the turret was showing up above. I mean, they were obviously stationary targets at that point, stationary, almost like bunkers, but same concept.
Minefields were laid. Perhaps Rommel's most ingenious inventions were the Rommelspargel, or Rommel's asparagus. Webs of metal wire strung along fields of short poles meant to shred gliders as they tried to land.
So the gliders would come in. They had pathfinders. They had the glider troops. So you have basically different waves of things happening, right? You have the gliders that come in, and their job's going to be with the pathfinders to set the beacons and kind of give homing signals and things like that for the paratroopers as they're coming in, so they know where to go. And so they were towed by C-47s, by these transport aircraft that would drop the airborne, but they had no engines or anything on them. They were gliders. And so Rommel looked for any fields where gliders might be able to land, and he would place these there. He looked for any fields where large numbers of paratroopers could land, and they would flood those.
Alongside anti-ship mines placed into the beaches atop angled poles driven into the sand. But static defenses were only part of Rommel's strategy. Hitler and the High Command had become convinced the Allies would land at the easy-to-reach Pas-de-Calais. Operatives confirmed this loudly and often, falling for the Allied deception operation, Operation Fortitude. Rommel, for his part, began to shift his view toward an Allied landing at Normandy. The beaches were similar to the Italian shore, and the Allies would want to maximize their chances of success by striking on familiar ground. Regardless of where the Allies came, Rommel argued that the only way to beat them back was through defensive action on the beaches, meeting the Allies as they landed and denying them the opportunity to take even a centimeter of ground. Given the quality of the troops defending Normandy, this was far easier planned than executed.
So it's a good point that Rommel is making here, because you know that there are millions of troops in the UK. Americans, British, Polish, a number of other nations, French. So by holding them at the beach, you limit the effectiveness of the force that's behind those numbers. Like 150,000 men in the initial waves at Normandy, along about a 50-mile stretch on these 5 beaches. So you hold them there, and they don't get a chance to use their numbers, because once they push inland and they widen that front, you can get more men on the front lines, and you more and more get men onto the beaches and inland, and the Germans can't hold that back. So I totally see where Rommel's coming from with that.
Normandy was the responsibility of the 7th Army, whose units in the area were, to put it mildly, of mixed quality. Promising recruits were siphoned off by SS, Fallschirmjäger, or Panzer recruiters, leaving a contingent of unfit or unremarkable men. Among the defenders of Normandy were the so-called ear and stomach battalions, composed of soldiers convalescing from combat wounds to their abdomens, or who were experiencing hearing loss, and Osttruppen, foreign auxiliaries from conquered lands forced to fight for the Reich, including many Soviet POWs. Naturally, most proved highly ineffective, with many deserting to join the French resistance or surrendering to the Allies at the first opportunity. The few capable soldiers either suffered from endemic fatalism, such as Captain Eberhard Wegemann of the 21st Panzer Division, who commented, "We were well aware that neither our men nor our tanks were good enough," or
that all said, it's important to note, and James Holland talks about this in his book, which is fantastic, by the way. I'm not all the way through it yet, but you want a great book on the Normandy invasion and on that campaign. It's called Normandy 44 by James Holland. So good. But he addresses all of this and acknowledges that, yes, a lot of these troops were not the best that Germany had to offer by 1944. But you also have an inherent will to survive. And when you are under this incredible bombardment and under attack by men who are coming there to kill you, you're going to fight for your life. And a lot of these Germans did.
Or were almost fanatically prepared to meet their foes. This attitude was usually evinced by the younger SS troops. As June 5th crept into June 6th, the Kriegsmarine pulled patrols from the English Channel. German meteorologists had declared the weather unsuitable for an invasion through June 10th.
And a lot has been made about how Ike had to delay the invasion by a day because of the weather. But from everything that I've read, and including I think in James Holland's book, while the weather may have improved a little bit on the night of June 5th from how it had been on the night of June 4th, the condition of the water, the ocean itself, was actually worse. And so much of why there were problems on D-Day with folks landing in the wrong place because they got pushed further to the east, or the tanks that foundered as soon as they came out, these DDs that were supposed to come out at like 3 miles out and float inland. So much of the trouble with those is because the waves were significantly higher than anything that they had prepared to land in.
There was, scientifically speaking, no chance of a landing. Rommel took these assurances as an opportunity to go on leave, returning to Germany to celebrate his wife's birthday and arrange an audience with Hitler to request additional panzers along the wall. Friedrich Dollmann, commander of the 7th Army, ordered a command post drill for his officers on June 6th. The evening was shaping up to be a quiet affair, and the Germans began preparing for the next day's routine, until Allied bombs began falling. This itself was not unusual, as the Allies had launched near-continuous runs against the Germans for some time, but this raid was an overture to Operation Overlord. As sentries fought off sleep, gliders began to make silent landings. As officers crawled into bed, paratroopers began to descend to Earth.
So one of the things that they do, and the bombers come in really up until the last minute. It's almost like like what you had in World War I with the creeping barrage with the men landing right behind it. Bombers were dropping bombs right up until just before the landings. And one of the things they were supposed to do is they were supposed to hit the beach with bombs so that it would create craters that would give the men places to go in, because they were landing at low tide to avoid all of the mines and things like that. But what that meant was they had a much further distance to go to get to the seawall where there would be protection. You had that big wide open beach. But in a lot of places, especially places like Omaha, the bombers didn't drop the bombs in the right place. They dropped them too far inland, and so there was no cover at all in many of those places.
Bewildered German commanders found enemies literally raining down on their heads and desperately rang to their superiors or assembled cells of ad hoc resistance. Lieutenant General Josef Reicher, commander of the 711th Infantry Division, recalled a night of drinking in the officers' mess ending in combat. The inebriated officer, pistol in hand, stumbled out into the night to find British paratroopers raining down on the 711th's command post. Reichert and his men were able to fend off the assault, and the still drunk general desperately rang to his superiors to announce the beginning of the Allied invasion. In the American landing zones, Lieutenant General Wilhelm Fahly, commander of the 91st Luftlandedivision, Division, was ambushed and killed by the 82nd Airborne just behind his headquarters near Saulmain-Iglay. Other Germans proved less willing to give battle.
So Saulmain-Iglay is near, if you watch Band of Brothers, you see that there's a mention of that pretty early on after some of the guys land. You've got Sergeant Lipton talking to Lieutenant Winters, and they're trying to figure out where they are, and Lipton says, I just saw a sign back there that said Saulmain-Iglay. But that was the 82nd area, so they had a long way to go to get to their intended target.
Rainer Hartmetz, a soldier serving near Normandy, rushed to his command post to find his officers gripped by battle shock. Two men were simply catatonic, while Reiner's company commander was sprawled drunkenly in a foxhole. Every time a runner brought news from the front line, the commander would idly threaten to execute anyone who returned to the scene of the action. As dawn began to light up the Normandy coast, the Germans were shocked to see an Allied armada steaming toward them. With no naval forces to challenge them, the Allied landing craft and their escorts took up their positions in the English Channel. And that's when the shells began landing. The opening bombardment of Omaha Beach caught German shore batteries in the middle of preparing for gunnery practice, turning...
So, before we get into it, since we can see the map right here, this is a good place to see the 5 landing beaches. Like I said, you're talking about 50 miles or so. I think Utah only had 2 landing zones. Omaha has like 10. And they were divided into sectors and then colors. And we're going to talk about all that in my videos from there. And then Gold, Juno, and Sword, which is where the British and Canadians landed. Omaha, I think overall for the Allies, somewhere like 10 to 12,000 casualties for the entire day on D-Day. And about a quarter of those come at Omaha Beach. Very few casualties on Utah. A lot of casualties, obviously, for the airborne inland. But a lot of those casualties happen at Omaha. You've got units like Able Company, 116th Infantry, which is all the way over here on the western end of Omaha. They're the ones who actually landed at Dog Green Sector, which is the one that you see in Band of Brothers. The Rangers there actually, I think, landed at Charlie Sector, which was just to the west of Dog Green. But basically, all of Able Company was pretty much wiped out in the first 20 minutes, half hour or so.
What should have been a morning of plinking in the Atlantic into a scramble for survival. Weathering this bombardment was the 716th Static Infantry Division, a unit of notoriously low quality. Composed of decrepit or boyish conscripts and ill-motivated Osttruppen, the division was denied the usual allotment of artillery and heavy vehicles their peers in the army enjoyed, relying on a hodgepodge of German armaments and foreign heavy weapons. But the 716th was not alone at Omaha, as other areas were defended by the much more powerful 352nd Infantry Division.
One of the things that makes Omaha even deadlier, in addition to all the other issues, is you see how it's kind of crescent-shaped? What that meant was that they could put artillery, machine guns, things like that on either end of the beach, and easily, on ends, see the entire beach from one end to the other and cover it all.
As battle was joined on the beach and American servicemen scrambled for cover, machine gunner Heinrich Zavelo of the 352nd could see the water spouts where my machine gun bursts were hitting. And when the little fountains got close to the GIs, they threw themselves down.
So you saw the reference there, and he's talking about the Beast of Omaha. My friend JD at the History Underground did a video from that site talking about the Beast of Omaha. He claimed to have killed as many as 2,000, or shot as many as 2,000 Americans, but that'd be pretty much all of the guys who went down at Omaha. So it's probably closer to several hundred.
They lay in the shallow water. Many tried to get to the most forward beach obstacles to find some cover behind them. I fired some more at the many dark foams in the water. Zavelo's senior, one Lieutenant Frerking, pitied the Americans as poor swine, even as he called more artillery strikes onto the floundering infantry. All over the beach, Zavelo could see wounded moving around on the bloody, watery slime, mostly creeping, trying to get to the upper beach and find some cover behind the shingle embankment. One by one, they would occasionally run in a crouch.
So Omaha's got this kind of cliff that overlooks it, right? So it makes it perfect for building these Widerstandsnests, which are these strong points. And they're numbered. I think the ones on Omaha are like in the 60s, like 61, 62, 63, etc. And then they had these areas that were called draws, which were the exits off of the beach that you could move armor and artillery up.
As the day went on, men like Zavelo and their heavy weaponry would make Omaha the deadliest landing on D-Day. The 716th Division at Sword Beach was a sorry affair. The overstretched Germans were severely lacking in air support or completed fortifications, and had utterly failed to coordinate with coastal artillery in their sector. The area teemed with vacation homes and coastal settlements, and save for some emplacements in the sand dunes and a handful of beach obstacles, was largely undeveloped. The individual soldiers were also of low quality, with Lieutenant Karl Haida bemoaning the condition of his division's officers. Many had been severely wounded previously. Some became unpleasant or socially inept due to their early harsh war experiences. I will not deny that some did get drunk at times. Lieutenant Schaff of the 716th noted that the rank and file were overworked and ill-motivated, too busy putting up wire and planting Rommel's asparagus to have much time for training. Indeed, the mix of Germans and Osttruppen defending Sword Beach routinely evinced a lack of care, as artilleryman Hans Glaub describes his fellow gunners failing to keep their pieces clean. Sword would prove to be a relatively smooth landing, with the Germans yielding the beach to British forces with minimum casualties. Their attitude would change when they met the more professional soldiers of the 21st Panzer Division launching a two-pronged counterattack to the east and west of Sword. However, Major Hans von Luch, commander of the Eastern Thrust, wrote in his memoir Panzer Commander of attempting to lead the 2nd Battalion of the 21st against dug-in British paratroopers only to be stymied by Allied aircraft and naval fire.
Gonna be going there too.
The German defense at Utah Beach was compromised by the airborne operations. Cut phone lines had crippled their ability to exchange information, while the spread-out landing zones made mounting a large-scale defense difficult. Utah and its environs were defended primarily by the 709th Infantry Division, made up of older Germans and the ever-ubiquitous Osttruppen armed with a bizarre mix of weapons. French, German, Polish, even Russian armaments filled their stores, but blessed with competent leadership at least. Lieutenant General Karl Wilhelm Graf von Schlieben, overall commander of the 709th, would order an actual organized counterattack in the face of the airborne assault, arranging for the 100th Panzer Battalion to drive forward to meet the 82nd Airborne at Saint-Mère-Iglay.
And that's tough because the airborne troops are, by their very nature, they're light infantry. They did, believe it or not, if you're not real familiar with the airborne operations, they did land some small artillery pieces, but nothing that's going to compete with panzers. Nothing that's going to be really effective in taking out tanks. You're going to have some bazookas and things like that, but the airborne are never really meant to or equipped for taking on armored divisions. But Utah is blessed by a couple of things for the Americans. Number one, they land in the wrong place, which ends up actually being a blessing in disguise in some cases. And they also have their assistant division commander of the 4th Infantry Division, Brigadier General Theodore Roosevelt. Theodore Roosevelt Jr., but technically Theodore Roosevelt III, because his father, who had been president, was Theodore Roosevelt Jr. But he very famously, when they gather all the battalion commanders together on the beach and figure out that they're like a mile off target from where they're supposed to be, he very famously says, well, we'll start the war from right here, and provides effective leadership, is given the Medal of Honor for his actions that day.
And at their critical bridgehead over the Mériday, the 100th would be driven back by the 82nd in spectacular fashion as the obsolete French tanks they deployed against the Americans were annihilated with bazookas and gammon grenades.
So there you have it. You're not dealing with panzers in this case. You're dealing with obsolete French tanks, so that makes a huge difference.
But the 82nd were not the only paratroopers in the area. The 6th Paratroop Regiment, under the command of Major von der Heide, pushed out of Carentan to reinforce their ground-based colleagues. As they came up,
these are the guys not only that you're dealing with in Carentan on D-Day, but if you are familiar with Band of Brothers, when the guys from Easy Company go into Carentan, and then later when they're fighting the Battle of Bloody Gulch, that's who they're facing as these 6 Fallschirmjägers.
Upon the Americans' landing zones, the Germans were astonished at the number of parachutes left behind. Yards and yards of silk littered the fields of France. The Fallschirmjäger would push onto the commune Saint-Côme-du-Mont, where Heide climbed the church steeple and saw the endless armada in the channel. Things were not much better for the Germans on the beach proper. Lieutenant Arthur Janke commanded Fort W5, a network of bunkers and pillboxes built into the dunes over the beaches, which was all but destroyed by the morning bombings. Janka recalled how the raids obliterated his position. Avalanches of sand and concrete buried his men alive.
That's just another example of where the bombing was much more effective at Utah than it was at Omaha,
forcing them to be dug out even as the assault on the beaches began. Spotting the American landing craft, Janka ordered what men he could rally to dig in, and ordered a dispatch rider to make for the nearest artillery battery to shell the beach. Janka's rider would be intercepted by American paratroopers. There was little Janka and his men could do as the landings began in earnest, with men and floating tanks fighting their way through the surf and straight toward the ruins of W5. A blast knocked Janka to the ground, and as his eyes fought to focus and the ringing in his ears subsided, he looked up through his skewed spectacles to see an American infantryman standing over him. As combat intensified on Normandy and reports of paratroopers and an Allied fleet flooded high command, the general staff thought to themselves, "This is all an elaborate ruse." The general staff passed this thought around as Hitler slept in. As more and more Allied troops and heavy equipment began making their way onto the beaches, Hitler finally rolled out of bed to be met with word of the invasion of France. The Führer could not have been happier. Hitler declared again that the Atlantic Wall would throw the Allies back, and he eagerly anticipated following up the inevitable failure of the Normandy landings by raining V-1 bombs on London. The Western armies would be ground into the sands of France, and the seat of his hated British enemies would be blown to smithereens by superior German weaponry.
Which it baffles me that at this point, obviously there's delusion going on here, but the Russians are starting to push forward on the Eastern Front. The Allies have already driven Germany out of Africa, and right around this time, they're pushing up into Rome. So they've taken half of Italy. What logical, reasonable person could have concluded that the war was winnable at this point? I don't know.
But as the day dragged on and the Allies began to gain ground, the frontline commanders flooded High Command with requests for support, requests to do something to prevent their positions from being overrun. The beacons of Normandy—
Wait, is that the dude from the meme? Oh my gosh, it is.
—were lit, but High Command would not answer the call for aid. Hitler, the only man on Earth who could release the panzers, would continue to insist that the Allies could and should be thrown back on the shore. This thinking had managed to seep into some of the defenders on Gold Beach. Friedrich Wurster helped crew a battery of 4 captured Czech cannons at Marie Fontaine near the beach. Wurster firmly agreed with his Führer that the Atlantic Wall was impenetrable, an attitude he kept right up until the British overran his commander's spotting position near the shore. In the face of Allied superiority in men and materiel, Wurster and his fellows quietly surrendered. Further behind the lines, the Germans were hard at work trying to corral the French civilian population. Propaganda vans drove through Caen, ordering the population to remain indoors while the German authorities began to arrange for the evacuation of key parts of the city. At von Rundstedt's headquarters outside of Paris, telephones rang continuously, and teletypes spewed seemingly infinite messages. Combat at Gold Beach began in earnest when the first landing craft dropped their ramps. The moment the metal hit the surf, German machine guns and artillery opened up on the British troops, who—
And it's important to note that not only in the British and Canadian sectors, but also in the American sectors, most of these landing craft are being piloted by members of the British Royal Navy, because most of the American Navy is dealing with the Pacific. So I think the number is something like 80% of the naval involvement in terms of piloting these landing crafts, they're British. So that's one thing that you see, for example, again, in Saving Private Ryan, you've got the American guy saying, 30 seconds, God be with you. Probably would have been a Brit, not an American.
Fought hard to clear the beach and sweep the fortified coastal houses the Germans had worked into their defenses. Indeed, the Germans put up a fierce fight at Gold, with elements of the 352nd Infantry raining fire on the British from a cliff top over the beach at Amel, including devastating volleys from a Flak 88. The British were only able to unseat the Germans at Amel with tank support, including a mortar-armed member of Hobart's Funnies.
Canadian time.
Elements of the 12th SS Division spotted the invasion fleet anchored off of Juno Beach in the early morning hours. Lieutenant Peter Hansmann of the 12th recalled being awoken by his NCO in charge, shaking my shoulders. Herr Leutnant, the invasion has started. Hansmann rushed to a vantage point near Gold Beach. Looking through my binoculars, I recognized the individual outlines of ships. At irregular intervals, flashes of ships' artillery were coming from various spots. Fast boats with high, white, foamy bow waves were spitting out brown clumps of men on the beach. The lieutenant counted over 400 ships in the channel from his front row seat to the end of the Third Reich.
Think about what that must have felt like. You know that you're preparing for the possibility of an invasion, but you've probably heard some things that, oh, it's probably going to be at Calais. You're probably going to be sitting here doing nothing. And then you wake up one morning to this sight of hundreds and hundreds of Navy ships. There are thousands along the whole 50-mile stretch, but just in front of your beach alone, hundreds of them. And all these landing craft, and you know you've got a limited force to defend with.
I wanted to shout at all the generals right up to Adolf Hitler, "Over here, quickly, before it's too late. Whoever can still fight, come here. The fastest, most powerful divisions, send them here. The Luftwaffe, where is it? The Kriegsmarine, where is it? It must get here." Grenadier Hans Weiner, who defended a position on Juno dubbed WN-31, recalled watching the first...
And again, I mentioned it earlier, but anytime you see that WN, that means Widerstand Nest, which is strong point, basically.
Tommies jumping into the sea, which was quite shallow. The bullets hit them and their boats to good effect, and I was a little surprised to see them falling. I don't know why. Weiner's position was eventually torn apart by the tanks coming ashore with the Canadians, which managed to drive inland under the barrel of 88mm cannons poised to shred them as they emerged from the surf. 88mm gunner Heinrich Zebel complained of not being able to see many tanks due to the smoke and chaos, though his gun claimed at least 2 Allied tanks before their blockhouse 2 was blown apart. The Germans provided a much tougher obstacle for their foes at the Tailleville Chateau, roughly 1 mile or 1.5 kilometers inland. Tailleville was supposed to be the starting point for a second line of defensive works laid out by Rommel before the Allied landings came. It was a well-built strongpoint, with a full communication and command complex and underground tunnels connecting it to Tobruk turrets armed with machine guns, cannons, and mortars. The defenders managed to hold the Allies back until nearly 6 p.m. that day, with their final message before the position was taken reading, "Hand-to-hand fighting inside the command post, hemmed into a closely confined area, but still holding out. Heil Hitler."
Still had time to say Heil Hitler at the end.
Not long after the fall of Tailleville, the Canadians began making their way toward the Luftwaffe airfield at Copycat, one of their key objectives.
This is really impressive that they got this far on day one, because that did not happen in a lot of places. We think about, okay, D-Day, but there was a lot of fighting on D+1 and D+2 and D+3. And for a good month or so, they're really not pushing that far inland. And then there's the breakout that happens.
The commandant of the airfield ordered an evacuation, inciting panic in his ground crews. The Germans made a hurried attempt to destroy the aircraft before they evacuated, but their haste proved fatal. Attempts to raise the airfield left most of the taxiing area of the runway untouched. The takeoff runway was damaged, but not sufficiently to render it unusable, and the vast majority of the field's fuel stores were salvageable. In this one case, haste ended up lessening waste. From the invasion of Poland all the way up until D-Day, the story of the Second World War is told from the perspective of the ascendant Nazi Germany, the Bronze Eagle casting a wide shadow over the history of the early war. But from the very moment the first Allied boot makes landfall in Normandy, the narrative changes, and the rest of the war is studied almost exclusively from the Allied perspective. We hope you have enjoyed hearing these personal recollections from German soldiers on Normandy, and agree with us that it is important to know the thoughts of even those on the wrong side of history.
Absolutely.
For it is only by seeing both sides of a conflict that one can form a complete picture.
100% agree with that, and I'm so glad that he did this and that he takes that attitude. We have to look at the story from both sides. You don't have to look at the story from both sides and therefore agree with both sides. You can see, for example, that Nazi Germany is clearly in the wrong, but still it's important to understand what these men on the ground were thinking and experiencing to really understand fully what it is that happened. So hope you guys enjoyed that. Hopefully many of you had already seen it. Really looking forward to bringing you some of these individual stories from the beaches in Normandy as well as inland. I'm going to be visiting the Somme as well and doing some more World War I content. Can't wait to bring all that to you. Thanks for watching. We'll see you again soon.